We are now joined by our keynote speaker, Athian Akec. Now, you've been to conferences before, but how many times have you seen a keynote speaker who's only 18 years old? Athian is an activist, a writer, a speaker. His main areas of focus are climate change, youth violence, and racial inequality. As a part of this, he's written for The Guardian, Independent, Huffington Post, ID Magazine, Huck Magazine, Hunger Mag, and other national newspapers. Additionally, he's in the House of Commons as part of the UK Youth Parliament. Athian also sits on the board of a youth charity and a commission in Camden focusing on economic renewal following the pandemic. Athian, welcome to the Knowledge Quarter Conference. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to hand it over to you. Please give us your keynote.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation here today. I kind of want to touch on the idea of the generational mission and what young people have to do in the face of the profound issues that we face today. So I'm 18. Born in the early 2000s, my generation is just now entering the wilderness of adulthood. We are individually, communally, and collectively attempting to navigate our way through the world. The conditions in which we're doing so are far from easy or stable or predictable. Our most formative years, in which we've forged our identities, perspectives, and viewpoints, have been in an age of seemingly endless crisis. At a speed never seen before, from more perspectives than ever, we've witnessed a thunderstorm of societal transformation, change, and turmoil. From the local to the global, social media has expanded our eyes to new perspectives and allowed us to hear from marginalized voices everywhere. We see beyond physical borders and consume information like no other generation before us. The age promise made to our parents and grandparents' generation that we as humanity are ever progressing, ever reaching towards equality, justice, and peace was not made towards us. The pandemic has only deepened the feeling amongst young people that things have to drastically change. The COVID-19 pandemic, to those who turned a blind eye, to those who are distracted and consumed by their daily life, has exposed some of the deep faults and inequalities in our society. While the pandemic has plunged so many across the world into poverty and destitution, we've seen more than 5 million people become new millionaires. While the most prosperous economies like the UK and the USA are now exiting the pandemic through our purchasing power and economic prosperity, all across Asia and Africa, the pandemic is being prolonged by vaccine shortages. The economic and social damage of the pandemic is deepening. While we wish to push forward to a better post-pandemic world, we have to acknowledge that the pandemic has served to deepen the inequalities within and between countries. That our vision for building back better has to be as big and as bold and as transformational as possible. The pandemic has shown that those who are central to keeping the world running are often undercompensated. The pandemic has shown that when crisis hits, it's the most marginalized who pay the most. The pandemic has shown that when these kind of crises hit, it's those who are marginalized by race, class, or geography who are damaged the most. It's also shown that people are far more empathetic, caring, and community-centered than we think. There is a consensus that we cannot return to the injustices of the past. But without a concrete plan to push us forward, we will sleepwalk back into the inequalities of the past. We will sleepwalk back into a society not too different from the one that we have today. We will sleepwalk back into a society in which we haven't learned the lessons of this pandemic. The near universal recognition that we cannot return to business as usual is a step in the right direction. But steps in the right direction are far from enough. To turn the concept of building back better from rhetoric to reality, my generation must play a key role. And I want to briefly outline today what we have to do. There is a consensus that we cannot return to the past, but without a concrete plan to push us forward, we will return back to what we have today. I also want to touch on what the Knowledge Quarter, these world-leading institutions, can do to support young people locally and nationally. For many young people, the last few years have been one where social activism, movements, and causes have spurred us into action on a wide scale. The activism has powerfully influenced public debate, discussion, and opinion. The Black Lives Matter movement and the school climate crisis strikes have shaped opinion on the climate crisis and racial injustice. Globally, nationally, and locally, young people are pushing forward these causes. We're shifting the way they're being viewed. In recent polling, 64% of people believed across the world that climate change is a crisis today. The Black Lives Matter process of 2020, which saw 26 million protesting in the USA alone, has shifted public opinion in the UK and across the world on issues of racial injustice. But after these waves of intense protesting, activism, and campaigning, what do we have to say for the material changes themselves? And while it would be naive to believe that change could come in 1 year, we have to be critical and ask, what are the material outcomes? But what is this historical moment calling for? I think it's calling for a fundamental transfer of wealth, resources, and power to marginalized communities. So if we compare inaction to what's happening, we've seen real change. But what we've seen in comparison to what is necessary is falling short. In response to the Black Lives Matter protests, we've seen little concrete action from governments to address disparities in the education system, the economy, the criminal justice system, and beyond. Compared to the threat of climate crisis, we've seen Parliament declare a climate emergency, and multiple world-leading corporations pledge to offset their carbon footprints. But we haven't seen the Green New Deal that we need to see to transform the world. There's a moral clarity that comes with youth, an inexperience that makes us uncompromising and impatient, that pushes us forward to tackle the problems we face head on. We as today's young people possess immense intelligence, energy, drive, and determination. But energy without direction and focus will get us nowhere. For me, generational purpose is what we have to discover, interrogate, and act upon. How are things fundamentally changed? How should we talk about change? How should we fight for it? How should we advocate for it? We've grown up in the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis, which drove a decade of austerity, which has robbed a generation, too many in my generation, of a decent opportunity, of a decent start in life, of safety. We've seen the climate crisis shift from what was perceived wrongly as being a distant problem in the future towards something which is affecting us today. We've seen the rise of social media bring awareness to police brutality and racial injustice faced by Black people all across the world. My generation, I believe, will be remembered in history as Generation Justice. We've come of age in a time where nothing seems certain. The system isn't working, and we're determined to change things. As someone involved in youth activism and politics, I often think about, with the profound challenges ahead of us, how my generation can best work to rethink, reshape, and reimagine the world. When focusing on generational purpose, the pioneering post-colonial thinker, writer, and psychoanalyst, Frantz Fanon, despite writing decades and decades ago, has a lot to tell us. On how each generation should shape the world, he said, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Those are powerful words we should hold in mind today. There's a moral clarity that comes with youth, but what is collectively being asked of us? So for my generation, what is the path towards discovering this mission? What is the path that will take us towards fulfilling this mission? What mistakes will lead us down the road to betraying it? And while I'm speaking from the perspective of a young person, as generations, we are interconnected and interdependent. Our fate is interdependent, and the modes of change we pursue as young people will ultimately impact everyone listening today and beyond. In this speech, I want to talk about what can be done by institutions in the Knowledge Quarter to support the next generation of change makers, the next generation who want to push change, the next generation broadly to pursue change on a local, global, and national scale. I was spurred into activism by the gaps I noticed growing up in a working class community in Camden, between what was being done by those in power and what needed to happen. I and countless other young people see this all around us on a range of issues. In terms of youth violence, an issue which I've campaigned on for more than 2 years, the dominant narrative we see in everyday political debate is that the issue will be tackled through more stop and search, more police on the street, and more prison sentences. In terms of growing up in the communities that politicians are abstractly talking about, I've seen with my own eyes how the closure of youth clubs, the cutting of mental health services, the hollowing out of the welfare state, and the general shredding of this country's social safety net has resulted directly in rises in violence. Between 2018 and 2020, I was privileged enough to be elected the member of Youth Parliament for Camden. Although the role came with many opportunities to meet interesting people, to work with political leaders, to write in national newspapers, to attend amazing events like this, what I got most out of the role was a sense of optimism. A sense that despite all the problems faced by our community, our country, and our world more widely, that there are people who are working diligently, passionately, with commitment and empathy within our communities to tackle the issues we've collectively faced. While my entry into politics and activism was a result of the youth violence that I saw affecting my community and the people around me, there have been many other young people who have been spurred into action by other issues, such as climate change, where there's a profound gap between the scale of the crisis and the action being undertaken by governments and corporations. The climate crisis is here with us today. Once again, there's a profound gap between what is happening and what is needed, the level of action that we are seeing and the level of action the moment calls for. The threat of climate change is here today. What we need, as I will later outline, is a Green New Deal, green infrastructure and green jobs. While the cost of doing so is undoubtedly high, the cost of inaction is even higher. And we must collectively ask ourselves, what do we want for young people and future generations to think of the course of action we chose today? The way I conceptualize history is from having an education which took me beyond the curriculum of the classroom. The history we are typically taught in our classrooms at compulsory education frames history and the past through the lens of the powerful. We study the past through the lens of monarchs, political leaders, those with wealth, power, influence, and status. But this blinds us to the importance of resistance by marginalized people, the profound historical impact of social justice and movements all across the history. This should open our eyes to the impact that we can have today. Learning about everything from the Haitian Revolution and the role it played in the ending of the slave trade, to how the Charterist movement was important in the development of social and political rights in early modern England. This allowed me to reframe the way I view power and contributed to the sense of empowerment that I feel. Change, in my mind, is not achieved by a select few people in powerful positions doing things differently. It's a synthesis of mass effort. It's about a diversity of approaches and perspectives. It's the community organizers working to tackle an issue in their local area. It's the young people mentoring, it's the youth workers mentoring young people to fulfill their potential. It's journalists highlighting ignored perspectives. It's those who work within pre-established institutions in the cultural, economic, political, and charity sector to increase accountability, to reshape purpose for collective good, and to build on true diversity. It's those who are rejecting a place in these institutions and pressuring them from the outside through protesting, campaigning, and political education. It's about artists showing us that another world is possible, using the power of imagination to push us to reach for something beyond we can physically see. And it's us collectively strategizing, working, thinking, and acting on how we can get there. One thing that we have to remember, even in the deepest depths of despair and chaos, that there's always something we can do to improve things. Even as the tides of inequality and injustice continue to pass over our communities, we can always do something to support. As a young person from a working class and Black background, now becoming involved in politics and growing with the platform that I have, I wouldn't be delivering this message today, this keynote, without key mentors and older people in my community and beyond who advised me and told me about the pros and cons of every decision that I've made. I think one of the biggest tragedies in this country is how we fail to harness the power of all young people. We have an education system that too often is not inclusive enough, that too often excludes and kicks out young people, that too often fails to truly harness the potential of everyone in the country. So at this moment, after their spectacular victory yesterday, I want to talk a bit about the English national football team. One of the team's biggest strengths is their diversity, in background, in playing style, in race and class. I know this personally. There are so many young people who are brilliant and excellent for my community and communities like mine. There are so many Raheem Sterlings whose brilliance doesn't just manifest itself in sport, but in so many other aspects of life. I know so many young Black people, so many working class young Black people, so many people that, given the right support, the right opportunity, the right mentorship, have so much to contribute in every area, from the corporate world to academia and everything in between. In the face of the big, bold, and profound challenges that your kind of companies and organizations are facing, we cannot afford to leave anyone's potential untapped. But we have to waver from hyper-individualized analysis. Our capacity to shape and change our own lives is there, but still our fates are often decided by how we relate and can navigate the education system and the economy. On these issues, it's a question of power. Who makes the decisions on the key aspects of our lives? It's all about rebalancing the scales of power. We have an excessive concentration of economic, social, and political power amongst a small number of people. In the post-pandemic world, I think three things need to happen that will underpin the progress that we can make. We need corporations we have an excessive concentration of power. And in the post-pandemic world, how we can tackle these three main issues will underpin the level of progress we make. We need corporations and individuals making the most money to pay their fair share of tax. There's a moral and there's a practical argument for it. The pandemic has shown just how interconnected and interdependent we are. Our fates are so intertwined that it's time, for once and for all, that we abandon the relentless individualism that we too often have in favor of navigating a world with increased awareness of the direct and knock-off effect of our individual and our collective actions. The causes of the divisions that we are living through today are undoubtedly material, but that doesn't give us the complete picture. I think we need to make increased efforts to bring people together from different communities, different parts of the country, who have different outlooks, different perspectives, different opinions, to come together and to realize common ground. I also believe that we need to expand our notion of democracy. The right to free and fair elections is and will remain a key part of our democratic principles, but I think it's time we expand them. We should ask ourselves, how can we give people more control over how their local areas run? How can we give workers more control over how they work? How can we decentralize our decision making? Change is the culmination of pressure and response, working within and across communities. It's conflict and solidarity and everything in between. It's about building a compelling narrative about why the world is the way it is, the capacity for us to shape it, and laying out a roadmap for how we can build a fairer future. It's a synthesis of this collective effort that historically and in the present will push us forward. Taking a singular view of change will lead us to fail in achieving the change we need. Each of us has talent, experiences, and knowledge to contribute to the ecosystem of change. But collectively, our efforts pursuing the change that we need is what we will deliver change upon. On an individual level, our perceptions of change is a result of our life experiences, what communities where we are from, and the intersections in society we sit at. However, no single group can achieve change independently. The key is to realize the overlap between different social causes, different issues, and to fight for them collectively. I think at the heart of what comes next must be a Green New Deal that works to decarbonize the economy while delivering jobs and investment and opportunities to the country's most marginalized communities. My generation is involved from a myriad of social causes, and the Green New Deal gives us a chance to tackle economic inequality, racial injustice, while tackling the climate crisis. I think pushing for a Green New Deal nationally and internationally is what we need to do. The climate crisis is an existential threat to us all, but tackling it through a Green New Deal gives us an opportunity to link together the various social causes and issues that we face. There are two truths that we have to bear in mind when looking at the post-pandemic future. Crises cost those who have the least the most. And further back, when we look at the pages of history, it becomes clear that any major transformation in society, that the most marginalized will lose out. The driving aim of our Green New Deal must be to tackle the threat of the climate crisis while building a more equitable world in the process. As young people, we are impatient when it comes to climate change, an issue that each day is reaching a more irreversible state. All the fights we are fighting are interconnected. There's a link between climate, class, race, and gender inequality, and all the other issues that young people are involved in. The first step, I believe, is a change in narrative and language. We have to make the language you use to talk about the climate crisis walk the fine line between stressing the seriousness of the existential threat we face without tipping into such hopelessness that feeds inaction rooted in dread and fatalism. We have to make a case for how we can tackle the climate crisis and fix the issues we face today. We have to motivate people into having a future worth saving, that they will be committed to saving. We have to make a case for how we can tackle this country's issues through solving the climate crisis. In communities all across the country, from the inner cities to the left behind towns, from Cornwall to Camden, a Green New Deal would bring jobs, investment, and infrastructure to communities who've been economically marginalized and not seen the fruits of post-financial crisis economic growth. My generation must be unrelenting in our pursuit of progress. When hope is lost, we have to continue to count our blessings, remember the people who have fought harder battles than us, and stick to the plan. We have to be a generation that works to bring people together when we reach our most divisive moments. We have to be a generation that strikes forward to change, even when there's resistance. We have to be a generation that recognizes the fundamental interconnectedness of the human experience and acts forward from there. We have to be a generation that endeavors to put the value of human life above that of profit, that puts action over indifference. We have to be a generation that resists the pull of fatalism in the face of hopelessness. We have to be a generation that turns pain into empowerment. We have to be the generation that turns loss and underappreciated stories of resistance, courage, and bravery in the face of injustice in the pages of history. We have to be a generation that recognizes the weight of the moment we are living in. We are truly at the crossroads of history, between building something fairer, more equitable, and more just, or sleepwalking back into the injustice of the past. We have to recognize that we are in a moment of tragedy, but that we can reach for the most bold and most transformational and biggest change possible. We have to look back in the decades to come and to be rest assured that whatever happens, we did what was needed of us. We did what this historical moment was called for. We did what was right. Thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic, Athian. There's so much there. I was trying to scribble notes and questions, but there's so much to cover. You've really articulately talked about what people of your age, your generation, the problems, and also you've tried to outline some of the possible solutions. We've got a few questions from the audience. I'm going to actually start with that. So the first one is, do you have any plans to run as MP for the House of Commons in the future? We need more voices like yours alongside those in power. That's from Rob Singh. Tell us about your ambitions of becoming an MP, Athian.
I think it's something I'm definitely interested in. I think the way that I kind of answer this type of question typically is that, look, entering politics, becoming an MP, that's all well and good. But it's up to those moments where you're there and you're in the right place at the right time. But committing and being there for your community and trying your best to do what is right by the people beside you is something you can do at any moment in whatever position you're in. So if I find myself becoming MP, that's something that would be great. But I think I'm committed to kind of working as best as I can to tackle the issues faced by my community. But I'm definitely not scared of trying to enter into those type of spaces, because I recognize that there are not that many people who are like me from my background who are given that kind of opportunity to enter there.
How did you become a youth MP for Camden? How did that happen? What was the journey?
So basically, it was in 2018, and they kind of did an assembly where they were like, does anyone want to run to be youth MP? And then, so that it's usually like one candidate from each school, and there were 3 from my school. One of them dropped out. We were all friends. So there were 2 people from my school, and then I recorded a campaign video, then I ended up winning.
It's fantastic. You talked about the need for communities to have more control of the local area. So if you had a magic wand, and if local communities in the Knowledge Quarter area, in the King's Cross, Euston, Bloomsbury area, could have more say in how the local area is run, where should they begin? What are the key things that they should be talking about and the key changes that they should be making, in your opinion?
In terms of from the communities or from the Knowledge Quarter? The
From
community.
and then the Knowledge Quarter as well, both.
I think they're all kind of interconnected, because if we look at the Knowledge Quarter, you have world-leading institutions who are kind of contributing to the knowledge that we have. But we also have a community who have a lot to contribute to these institutions. And these institutions have a responsibility to these communities. So I think in terms of there's kind of three ways that I think about this. I think if we look at from the perspective of young people, one thing that I'd want to see Knowledge Quarter organizations is try to actively engage with young people and to provide opportunities, because like we have Google in this area, we have loads of world-leading institutions. So I want to think, how can we get the schools that we have locally? How can we use that world-leading knowledge to help contribute? How can we bring young people from the range of backgrounds seen in Camden into those buildings? How can we give those life-changing opportunities to young people? Like, because the institutions are literally there. It's a question of coordination and action. Because it's kind of a mutualistic thing. We're in a world in which these institutions, the Knowledge Quarter institutions, are vying and speaking to increasingly globalized and diverse audiences. You have one of the most diverse communities, arguably in the world, right at your doorstep. So one thing that I want to see is that kind of active engagement. How can we create young work experience opportunities for young people? But then one thing I want to touch on is this idea of corporate social responsibility. Because I think as a result of being in this area, that these corporations and institutions have a responsibility to the local community. And so one thing I want to think is, how can we have accountability? How can we make sure that in the decisions being made by the Knowledge Quarter in the coming years, both geographically and beyond, that we can make sure that we have that direct link and communication with the various communities in our area? But I think it's all a question of dialogue and space. It's about how can we get young people, people from all across our communities, to actually know and be interconnected with these institutions. And that's something that I'd definitely be kind of interested in working on in the future.
Yeah. One more question has come from the Hublot conferencing site. It's estimated that fewer than 85 people own half the world's wealth. What are your thoughts on how we can influence more of those people to sign the pledge developed by Bill and Melinda Gates to encourage the super rich to give their wealth away and to give it away for benefit of many?
I think we have to challenge our increasing propensity towards philanthropy. Because it's not just a question of how these individuals have become so wealthy and what they do after. It's about the processes by which they've acquired this wealth. Look, I'm not someone who's going to sit here and say that no one should ever acquire any wealth. I think that's silly and that doesn't make sense. But this level of, I think, what I fundamentally get from speaking to people about wealth inequality is that it's all about a perception and a reality that we're in a fair system. It's not about everyone having absolutely the same. It's about us. We have to feel and we have to have a reality in which everyone's playing by the same rules. And so this question of amassing that much wealth and giving it away, we have to ask, how have these people amassed this much wealth? And I personally believe that the best way, in terms of people who are super wealthy, in order for their funds and wealth to be redistributed, is not through philanthropy, it's through taxation. I think taxation is a fundamentally much more democratic way of deciding how your wealth is used. And I think this issue about taxation is really important, because we live in a society in which there's a kind of idea that if we tax the rich over a certain threshold, the kind of our economic system is going to fall apart. And this is factually not true. There was a point in the USA towards the kind of the point of World War II where they had a top rate of tax of 91%. And I'm not saying we have to return to that, but we have to return into a situation in which the rich are paying their fair share of money, because ultimately the wealth in our society is not just a question of capital or labor. It's about the collaboration between these. It's about the workers who are on the floors of our shops generally being reimbursed for how they contribute and underpin the economic system. So to that question, I would kind of finish with one line. philanthropy is not the generosity is not the substitute for justice.
Right.
Generosity is not the substitute for justice.
Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful quote to end your keynote on. Thank you, Athian.